Up until the time of the Reformation, Christian theologians had, in thinking about the knowledge of God, had divided it into what we might call his natural knowledge and his free knowledge. All right? And on this side, on the natural side, is God's knowledge of himself. So God knows himself perfectly. Unlike creatures, he does not have to learn things. We learn things about ourselves all the time. God is not in any learning process in any way, shape, or form. There are people who believe that. There is something out there called process theology, which is, whew. Anyway, God has all knowledge of himself, and God likewise has all knowledge of what he could do. So if God knows himself perfectly, then he knows what he is capable of doing, and he knows what any act of creation that he could bring forth would look like. And so this would include knowing what kind of creatures he could make, how long they could live, what their capacities and abilities would be. And of course, most importantly, and this is why I fear that very often the conversation does get somewhat lost. What's most important in sound biblical theology in thinking about this is God and his purposes. If it is God's intention to demonstrate his attributes, his wrath, his power, his justice, as well as his love, his mercy, his grace, this creation is about God. And as I read so much of philosophy, it's not about God. It's about mankind. It's about putting God into the categories of mankind. I see it all the time. And so the natural knowledge of God would be about God and what God can do. About God and what God is going to accomplish to reveal his attributes. That's the natural. The free knowledge of God is his knowledge of everything that he has done in creation. And so we could have right here, could put a line here, and this is the decree of creation. And so when we talk about the relationship of these what are called moments in God's knowledge, we're not talking about chronological things. We're not saying that this comes before that chronologically. These are logical moments. They speak to the relationship of these moments in God's knowledge. And so once God has created, then he has free knowledge, which is knowledge of everything that has taken place. And that would also include a knowledge of counterfactuals. What do I mean by that? Well, we have illustrations in Scripture. God tells David, yes, Saul would do X, Y, and Z, therefore get your tush out of there. If such and such had happened, then this would happen. But this is all after the decree. And so this is based upon the fact that God knows what Saul's going to do, not only because God knows all of time, but God made Saul. And God created Saul in a certain way. So, for example, isn't it obvious that in Saul's experience, the fact that he was a big man, he had great physical prowess, don't you think that entered into how Saul did things and responded and acted? It did. But who made Saul tall? Who made Saul tall? Who called Saul? I don't know. I never watched that TV show either. God did. So it's after the decree. So it's a counterfactual. Saul would have done this, but he didn't do it because it didn't actually happen. It wasn't what God's decree said. But the point is that it is a result of God's choice, which is right there. This is where God's will and choice is seen. And so that free knowledge results from what God has chosen to do. So what has happened since the days of the Reformation? Well, really, it was more of a period of time post-Reformation and Counter-Reformation, is that there has been an insertion of what is called middle knowledge. Middle knowledge. Why is it called middle? Because it's between God's natural knowledge and his free knowledge. That's why it's called middle. That doesn't seem like the best terminology, but there wasn't anybody in charge of creating terminologies back then, so you go with it. And this middle knowledge, which no one had really thought that God needed before, some people will actually attribute some development of this to some Anabaptists, but most people would say that this is the creation of Louis de Molina, who is a Jesuit. And the Jesuits, of course, were tasked with finding a way to counteract the Reformation. The Reformation was preaching strongly God's sovereignty in the affairs of men and in salvation, and this undercut the Roman Catholic system of the sacraments, and especially the synergistic system of the Roman Catholic Church. And so what you do is you come up with this idea that God has a special kind of knowledge, middle knowledge. And what middle knowledge allows God to know is what's interesting to me is this is only relevant to man. It's only relevant to free creatures, quote unquote. It has nothing to do with anything else. And all of creation has nothing to do with stars or galaxies or anything. It's just all about man on planet Earth. And what middle knowledge does is middle knowledge tells God that if you have John Smith, okay? We've got John Smith over here. And John Smith, if God places John Smith in any set of circumstances, so if God creates a world where John Smith lives in the 20th century and lives in Europe, it's over in England. John Smith will join the army and he will be in the Air Corps. Because this middle knowledge gives God infallible knowledge of anything John Smith would do, no matter when John Smith lives, in any world that God would place John Smith. Now, think about what all that means. Because John Smith doesn't just pop out of the air. John Smith is the offspring of an entire line of people. So, how could you know? This is something we got to keep in mind. How can you know these things? But whatever world and one of the most important things is God would know which worlds in which John Smith would accept Jesus and which ones he wouldn't. And there's even discussion that God would know that there is no world in which John Smith would ever accept Jesus. That's interesting. So this middle knowledge, you need to see, is before this line. It's before the decree to create. Because middle knowledge then serves to delimit the possible worlds that God can create. So because he has middle knowledge, God can run all these massive numbers of scenarios where he has every possible person, and he knows what every possible person will do in any given situation, whatever age they're put in, whatever. And then he comes up with a decree of creation. Now, there's disagreement amongst Molinists, people who follow Molina. There's disagreement as to exactly what the algorithm is. That's how we describe it today. He's running the numbers. Is he going for maximal number of people saved? Is he going for maximum amount of good? Does he go for a balance between the maximum amount of good and the least amount of evil? They don't know. And the reason they don't know is, as soon as I drew this, I stopped talking about the Bible. Because there's nothing in the Bible about this. I mentioned counterfactuals over here, but there's nothing about, there cannot be, by definition, anything about middle knowledge in the Bible. Why? Well, proponents of middle knowledge will make reference to, for example, the Saul incident in Matthew 11 and stuff like that. But that has nothing to do with middle knowledge. It can't, by definition. It's post-decree. Middle knowledge has to be before the decree, or middle knowledge becomes irrelevant. Why do I say it becomes irrelevant? The only reason to come up with middle knowledge is to find a way to artificially say that God is sovereign and man is autonomous. The cost of that is to say that there is this middle knowledge that defines what every person will do. Every person will do exactly this and nothing more in any given situation. But John Smith here is known by God before God decrees to make John Smith. That is the key assertion of middle knowledge. There's some proponents of middle knowledge don't even want to talk about this. They sort of want to do the C.S. Lewis mere Molinism type thing. They didn't want to try to substantiate this. Because the reality is, what Molinism is based upon is the assertion that there is some source that defines what every free creature would do in any given situation. And it's not God. It can't be God, because then that would be on this side of the line of the decree. So, back here to John Smith. God has not decreed to make John Smith. And yet somehow God knows what John Smith will do. But you and I both know that so much of what we do is based upon God's decree. There are certain things that have never entered into my mind because God never created me to be able to do those things. I have never been tempted to be a mountain climber. God didn't make me that way. That's not going to enter into anything, but it's part of the decree. All of our decisions are based upon the gifts that God has given to us, the inheritance from our family, from our progenitors, our ancestors, the context in which we've been placed. And all of that is a part of what? It's over here. It's part of the decree. So how can God know? How can even God know what a free creature he has not designed or defined would do in circumstances he has not defined or created? Well, it's all hypothetical. But if it's all hypothetical, here's the problem. This middle knowledge in Molinism determines what worlds God can and cannot make. So when he is looking at possible worlds, He is limited in what worlds he can make by the content of middle knowledge, which does not come from his, there we go. It doesn't come from his eudokia. It doesn't come from his boule. It does not come from his will. We don't know where it comes from. It just is. It's just something God has, except it limits God. And it limits his choices. By putting it before the decree then becomes limited to what God is allowed to do on the basis of what has been determined by middle knowledge. He cannot decree to make a world in which all are saved, because there are certain people that, according to middle knowledge, will never be saved. So who determined that? This is the issue. And oh my goodness, the lengths to which our Molinist friends will go to stand on their heads and use empty language and never get around to. I have a clip that I'll eventually play for you, where a well-known young Molinist today just is asked this direct question: how does God have knowledge of what a free creature will do when God has not decreed the very nature of that free creature, what his intelligence is going to be, what anything about him, his physicality, his spirituality, his intellect? Our decisions are all determined by these things, and they all come from the decree. You have this weird idea that men and women can somehow be reduced to some kind of floating ethereal thingy-me-bobby that gets defined by something out there we don't know, and God goes, oh, that's what those things are going to be. No. That's why up until this point in time, everybody had thought natural and free, that covers it. Everything God can do, knows himself perfectly, and everything there's nothing more. You stick this in here for one reason, and only one reason, so that you can pretend that you have an autonomous creature. That's pretense. It doesn't work, but that's what you're pretending to do. So the issue that we have now seen in looking at last week, Ephesians 1, here's the issue. Where does the definitional content of middle knowledge come from when you do not have the decree of God? Because in the moments of God's knowledge, it comes prior to. You can't appeal the decree. So how can you have a disembodied, undefined, undecreed John Smith and yet know exactly what he will do in any given set of circumstances? That makes John Smith into something the Bible never describes any of us as. Did anything we just read from Isaiah even smack of anything like that? Is there any evidence whatsoever that any prophet, any apostle, ever even dreamed of this? None. Absolutely none. And yet, you have people today going, that just answers all the questions, doesn't it? And they really believe that it does. I've heard people interviewing folks going, man, that just, you can have a sovereign God, and yet we're doing only what we will, and that just answers all the questions. Poor objector in Romans 9, don't even know why Paul could have just said, you don't understand middle knowledge? Come on. There's a way around this. That's why they got to do with it the way that they do. The sad thing is, the result is this decree is no longer an expression, hence self-glorifying expression, of the triune God's eudokia. It is now what he gets glorified for is being this supercomputer that you feed in all the data from middle knowledge, and that data from middle knowledge then allows him to understand which of the many possible worlds over here he can actually actuate And then you have this idea that mankind is somehow free, but it's not. It's a really cheap freedom. Because how can you really say, oh yeah, man does whatever he wants to do, except God micromanages everything around him, so he does only what God wants him to do? What kind of autonomy is that? Oh, but he's still free because of middle knowledge. So you end up with creatures who do what they do because God's put them in that situation, and they couldn't have done other because middle knowledge already said what they were going to do. And then you end up with a God whose decree is basically that of a quantum computer. You fed the stuff in, you ran the algorithm, and now his eudokia becomes the output of a quantum computer. And we call it good. Okay, there you go. There you go. See why it's important? See why it matters? And automatically what happens at this point is people go, well, I've read such and so. Okay, all right.